I was pretty surprised when I left the military because I would go, I would join some organization, and all of a sudden you discover that everything's not as simple as it was in the military, right? Like in the military, I was a sergeant. And if you were a corporal, then I told you what to do. And if you're a staff sergeant, you told me what to do. And then all of a sudden, I had a boss, of course, but then my boss, he didn't really have a rank, right? And then the person from marketing who would tell my boss, no, you're definitely going to add that feature to the software. Why did my boss say yes to that person? That person doesn't have any direct reports. That person doesn't have like a rank associated with them. So for me, I think there was a long learning curve of figuring out where do people fit in to this power hierarchy and how should I behave within it.
Hello, and welcome to the New Mission Career Transition Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Caprellian, and I'm joined by my co-host, sister, and HR pro, Alexandra Caprellian. Today, we have a great guest, James Ferrara, or Jimmy, and he's a prior Marine who went into computer programming. He finished his bachelor's degree in computer science, and he has a very interesting career path. Plus, we're going to cover some nomenclature here, job descriptions, what it means to be a software engineer, and some other job descriptions in that sector. I also asked him questions about coding boot camp. I was really surprised with this answer. If you've ever thought about doing it, you're going to want to listen to the rest of this content, so stay tuned. Jimmy Ferrara, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
This is cool because we've got another Marine on the line, and we're going to talk about IT, tech. I'm really looking forward to picking your brain. We were just talking before we started recording about, the job titles. Like, I'm a guy that doesn't have an IT or tech background specifically. And so just like I think you were mentioning, billet descriptions in the Marine Corps can be pretty misunderstood or really unknown outside of the Marine Corps or really outside of the military. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. But before we do, I'd like you to kind of tell the audience like a little bit more about yourself, Jimmy. And first, where did you grow up and how did you join the Marine Corps?
Cool. Okay. Yeah. I grew up with a military family. My dad was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And so I thought it was fairly normal to travel and to move a lot. And yeah, so I kind of grew up all over and ultimately settled in Virginia, up Northern Virginia, like Fairfax area. And, I ended up going to college around there. And yeah, that's sort of that.
And why the Marine Corps? Like, did that recruiter get you?
That's funny because we both know my recruiter, who I think
that's right.
Almost 20 years ago recruited me. So I was a little bored with college. The dot-com bust had come around. I was in college for computer science, and so I could sort of see the writing on the wall, like there's not a lot of jobs out there. And I was restless, I was like a young 19-year-old, full of gusto for the world, and the war in Iraq had just kicked off. And actually I thought, man, I'm going to miss this war if I don't join the military stat, which is sort of like darkly humorous because I could have gotten probably 3 PhDs and still gone to Iraq. But yeah, I went to the recruiting station, and the Air Force and the Army people and the Navy people didn't really appeal to me. And, I walked into the Marines office, and Trinity said, I said, hey, how fast can I join? And Trinity looked at me and he said, well, first you got to do some pull-ups before we talk. So I did a bunch of pull-ups, and then he said, well, when are you thinking of joining? And I said, I don't know, pretty soon. And he goes, well, what's today? I said, it's Thursday. And he goes, you want to go on Tuesday? And I asked for like 2 more weeks, and then off I went. And that's how the great adventure started. So,
well, listen, Trinity got you. Trinity got you.
Yeah.
That's great.
Sure thing. Yeah, you didn't have to work that hard. I'll say that.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, it's like gold. It's gold. Like he wants to ship tomorrow.
He was probably waiting for me to pull out just until the last minute, like who's this prankster that my coworkers have sent to me just to bail. But no, I wanted to join, and I thought it'd be interesting, and I had no clue what I was getting into. I did no prior research. I watched a lot of Marine Corps commercials on YouTube, and I thought that's pretty cool. So
That's cool. Like, and Jimmy, Trinity was like, he was like, man, I know who you should interview next. I put him in the Marine Corps. He's doing awesome. He's got this amazing story. So yeah, shout out to Trinity, who just, as a matter of fact, he had his retirement ceremony just
yeah,
like almost a month ago. So he's got this full grown beard. I'm so jealous.
I've been
I'm
watching
so
it grow out
jealous.
on Instagram every day. It's longer.
So when you joined, like, I understand you had a change of MOS somewhere between recruit training and your first fleet unit.
That's true. So I went to boot camp on the East Coast in Paris Island, and somewhere in there, I broke my foot, and they said, hey, you should, you're going to be here for some extra time, which I was admittedly not excited about. Kind of wanted to get out in the minimum amount of time or less. But long story short, I did some volunteering, sort of like some extra work on the base there. And the master sergeant I was doing work for said, hey, what's your job going to be after you get out of this thing? And I said, infantry, which I'd picked infantry because I didn't know there were any other jobs in the Marine Corps really. And I didn't put a lot of thought into it. And he was like, why don't you pick another job? And at that point, I had really acquainted myself really well with the manual for Marines. It's like that tan book they give you in boot camp. It's the only book you get. So if you're going to sit around with a broken foot, you're going to read it probably about 50 times. And he was like, pick a new job. And I was like, Intel. That is what I would like to do. This infantry thing is a lot of walking. It seems really hard. And I would like to do Intel. That seems like, very frankly, an easier job. So yeah. And he made it happen. I met some guy, after that, he sent me to another office, and the guy goes, so you want to be Intel? And I was like, yeah. And he did all the kind of screening questions. And then at the very end, he goes, well, what do you like more, pictures or books? I said, pictures. And he goes, great. You'll be doing maps. And that was that.
What happens if you chose books?
So the books become all source analysts, and they read reports, and then they figure out things from the reports. But the picture lookers, you make maps, and you sometimes look at imagery and sort of try to pick out what's going on.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had three deployments, right? Three deployments while you were in?
So yeah, so it was sort of the height of Iraq. I joined in 05, and then by the time I was out of my MOS school, it was maybe early to mid 06. There are only three intelligence companies in the Marine Corps, first, second, and third. And third is sort of stuck out there in Okinawa doing their thing. And then so first and second were rotating on and off in Iraq. And so you go for 6 or 7 months and then come back, and then the other, intel battalion would go out there, and then you would swap back with them. So it's sort of 50% of the time you're in Iraq and 50% of the time you're home, plus a little time for turnover. And so we did the battalion I was with did 3 tours in the winter. So 06, 07, 07, 08, and 08, 09. And I was done. Like by the end of that, I had 3 different girlfriends who had met 3 fantastic people, to which 2 of them are still married. And I was like, I'm done with this. I'm pretty tired of going to Iraq, and I want to get out. But I loved the experience. It was formative, and it was fantastic. And I didn't, I think it's important to say I did not get out of the Marine Corps with 2 middle fingers up. A lot of people get out and they're pretty salty about it. But I felt pretty good about it. I thought that was an experience. I'm done with that, and I appreciated the training they gave me. Like, it was really life changing.
So what did you do when you got out? Like, what was your game plan, and was the game plan slightly different from what you executed? If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Okay, so I had a lot of time to think about getting out. That's one thing every Marine has. And so I knew I wanted to go to college. At the time in Iraq, you would meet these people who came back. They got out and they came back, and they were, kind of like the mythical, like making just buckets of cash, and it's so fantastic. And I made like whatever I made as a Marine, but now I'm making 10 or 20 or 30x that. And I thought that's interesting, but eventually this war is going to end, and the Afghan war is going to end. And I want to have something to fall back on besides I could just go to Iraq a lot, right? And I had this clearance, which was also worth a lot of money. And I knew I wanted to go to college. And the post 9/11 bill, GI Bill, that got passed while I was in the Marine Corps. So that was really nice because before I had looked, and I think it would offer $1,100 a month to cover everything from tuition to books to room and board. But then the post 9/11 GI Bill it just opened the door wide. And I was like, okay, that is 100% what I'm going to do. And I gone to college in Norfolk before the Marine Corps, and I thought I'm for sure going to go back to Norfolk. Right, I'm not interested in going to another city and starting over at a different college where all my credits might not transfer to. And I had a network in Norfolk, and so I knew people. I knew a guy, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to be roommates? I want to deal with paying all the rent myself." And I had friends, and I sort of knew the layout of the city, and I knew the college. And so I spent almost all of my last deployment sort of planning and figuring out applying to college, getting the yellow ribbon stuff done, which is where the state college matches your tuition. So I just spent a lot of time planning that. And then when I got out, I mean, I should also say, like, I was a single guy with obviously no girlfriend. I knew how that worked out. And I had 2 Foot Lockers of stuff and 2 surfboards. And so I put all that stuff in my beat up SUV, and I drove like 3 hours north to Norfolk. And so other people have like a really complex transition plan, right? Like they have kids, their kids are in school, they have like a wife, they have, friends and stuff. They've been there for 10 years. But I was like, whatever, goodbye, Camp Lejeune. I'll go find waves elsewhere.
After you finished your degree in computer science, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I got a degree in computer science, and then I like the map stuff. I still love maps, and so I got like a certificate in GIS, which is Geographic Information Sciences. So yeah, okay, so yeah, I guess I should. This is also part of the transition, which is I got out of the Marine Corps. I did 2 years of college. That finished off the degree and the certificate, and sometime maybe I graduated in like April or May. In January, I started interviewing, and actually, I really didn't put a lot of thought into this. I'll be really frank about that. I kind of poked around at a few jobs, but I had I had enjoyed the Marine Corps, and a bunch of my friends and former coworkers were working down in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and one of them said, "Hey, you should come down here and interview. Maybe we'd be looking for a GIS guy who could help us do analysis and maps and imagery and stuff like that. And you're good with computers. So do you want to come down and do that?" And the team down in Fayetteville was pretty cool, pretty specialized guys. And so I was like, yeah, and they quoted me, a salary, and it was probably 2 or 3x what the Marine Corps had paid. So not an insane amount, but still pretty healthy for a single guy. And I actually, after that, I didn't interview anywhere else. I was just like, that's cool. I'll go to North Carolina, sure. And maybe I'll actually pause there and say one other thing, which is I had talked to a friend of the family who had been like a colonel in the Air Force and got out and did a bunch of contracting stuff. And he asked me, he said, "What do you want to do?" But I was like, "What do you think I should do?" And he was like, "No, what do you want to do with your life?" And I was like, "Well, I really like a continuation of the Marine Corps where they just pay me more money and I don't have to shave." And he was like, "Okay, but you need to think and introspect about your life." And then I left and I didn't do any of that. And somebody showed up and they were basically like, "Well, you don't have to shave. We'll pay you a lot of money and you'll do kind of the same thing as you did in the Marine Corps." And I was like, yeah, that's cool. And it wasn't a waste to go and work with those teams. Like those teams are world class, epic people to work with. But looking back, I can see maybe I should have thought more about that because I really just got lucky. I didn't put any thought into that switch.
Do you think it was because you were going where you felt comfortable, or at least what you were familiar with? Is that a fair description?
I think it's common of all military folks. Maybe not all. I shouldn't say that. But when I talk to people from my platoon who are getting out or have recently got out, a lot of them struggle to articulate what they want to do. And I think it's, especially as an enlisted Marine, people tell you exactly how you should put your boots on and where the laces in your boots go and exactly how to wear your clothing. You know exactly where to show up every day. And actually, the projects you work on, you really don't get a lot of leeway to say, well, actually, I don't find studying mudslides interesting in this specific region of this country. They're just like, no, that's what you're going to do, and you don't question it. And so I think that is a learned sort of behavior where you don't question things for very good reason in the military. But as you get out, you really need to start to question things and say, like, well, I don't know, like, that's good money, but will that be fulfilling to me? Will I be happy doing that? Or am I going to find myself sort of back on the hunt, a year from now, something like that?
Hmm. So what happened? Like, what was your experience overall at that location, and then what led you to change where you were at and what you were doing?
Yeah, so it was a good experience overall. People, I mean, epic, really great people to work with, very talented, totally aggressive people. I ended up, doing some more time overseas as a contractor. And I remember there was a point when I was in this huge room, we're all working in this, the classic deployment plywood office. There's like 100 people. And I looked around and I was like, I think every single person except me has been divorced at least once, sometimes some people twice, and some people three times. And I just gotten off the phone with of course, my latest girlfriend, who had met a wonderful person in her apartment building, and they were just turning into great friends. Now they're married. And I was like, I got to get out of this business. This is just like not working out from a romantic perspective. And so, as a friend of mine said, look, do you want to come work with a team up near DC? And I was like, yeah, there's definitely no girls in Fayetteville. No offense to anyone in Fayetteville, but romantically speaking, I was like, I'm not going to start a family in Fayetteville. Sorry, Chris, you invited me here to talk about transitioning, but all you've gotten is my love life.
I love it. I love it. Tell me more about Fayetnam.
So I left the fine metropolis of Fayetteville. I always used to joke. People would say, "What'd you move here for?" And I always say, "The ballet." And they just fall over laughing because if you've ever been to Fayetteville, there's no ballet. Anyway, so I moved to DC, and I was kind of like working an office job up there. I met the woman who is now my wife, and I started to think, well, this is interesting. This work is kind of monotonous. I'm definitely not going to deploy anymore because that wasn't working out. The wars are also kind of winding down, getting a little more serious with this girl. Maybe I should start looking elsewhere for work because actually I'm not super fulfilled by the work if I'm not deploying. And so that is when I really started branching away from the defense world, and I started looking at civilian companies, which was pretty scary because I had always thought I really love the job security of working government contracting gigs, which everyone knows your contract could get cut or terminated or whatever, but there's always another contract to go to. And if you know the people, the job interviews are super chill, and there's not like a lot. I don't want to say it's like not hard work. It's hard work. But I thought like I could do this until I'm like 50 or 60 and retire. I'll probably be pretty bored by then. And that was just me, and the place I was at. So then
Hmm.
I started looking for other jobs. I reached out to my network of kind of former military people. There was a startup doing consulting software development. And so basically what that means is you would come to them with typically a defense intel problem and say, there's no software on the market that does this. Could you build it for us? We, the US government or whoever, will pay you by the hour. And then, we, the software engineers that worked at that company, would by the hour write software and bill those hours back to the government. And then we would, say at the end of 4, 5, 6 months, here's your software. Have a good day. Goodbye. Come back if you need more software. And it was cool. It was like a really easy transition. I knew a lot about the space that we were writing software in, and I had a computer science degree. So yeah, so that was like my first foray into the software world, very strictly speaking, outside the government.
Okay, and that's interesting. So in that sphere, because I'm kind of interested in knowing more about that. What was your role? Were you actually developing the software, or were you interfacing between the client and the developers?
So I would write the software in that situation.
And then how was that? How did you get your software requirements? Was that something that somebody in your company gave you, or was that just interacting with the client, so to speak?
Okay, yeah. So the clients would come in and they would describe to I think the word we would use now is a solutions architect. They would describe to the solutions architect, hey, we have all this data. We don't know how to manage it or how to visualize it, or we want to extract some analysis out of it. What do we do? And then the solutions architect is sort of a salesperson in a sense, but a very technical salesperson. And so they know what is possible in the realm of possibilities. Like, what could we do with this data, right? Like, if you give me a copy of the Bible, I can't turn that into a 3 hour long feature film, the Bible, right? Like, that is not in the realm of possibilities. But I can count up every word and tell you how many times various words occur and, like build some sort of model from that. So the solutions architect sort of has that understanding. They gather the requirements, they kind of make the sale and say, like, look, this is what we're going to do for you. This is how we're going to put things together. And then they come back and they tell us engineers, they say, okay, like, here's what we're going to do for this customer. Here's the final deliverable, code it. And then maybe typically our teams were like 3 or 4 people. We'd code for 40 hours a week. We might have a few meetings stuck in there. We might do some work tracking, just to say, like, hey, what are you working on? I'm working on this. You're working on that. All up, it was a pretty novice world of software development. Like, it was a very small company. All of the software was delivered and we didn't have to run it ourselves. And so it's kind of the perfect world of very profitable things to do, because you're selling time you're really selling time and you don't have to maintain the software whatsoever. So does that sort of get to the core of what you're asking?
Yes. No, that was perfect. And solutions architect. That's funny because I apply it through my own lens of my limited experience. And I found that as an engineer in the Marine Corps, one of the challenges is trying to take a command's desirements and really kind of sort out, well, what are the desirements and what are the requirements? And then have that shaping conversation of, okay, this is what's within the realm of the possible. This is what I think we can do. And then taking that back to those subject matter experts that actually know how to do the design work, develop the BOM, do the procurement, execute construction on site, so on and so forth. So it's just kind of interesting to hear that there are parallels between, software development world and kind of some of the world that I've been in the engineering world, military engineering world. So where'd you go to after that?
I really didn't do a long time in that sort of consulting world. I I just didn't love it that much. I thought it would be more interesting to work at like a software company that ran its own software, because there's some complexity that comes with that. So after that, I went to a cybersecurity startup, but this was sort of a bigger thing, right? Like the first startup, the consultancy, had been entirely self-funded. And the next one was venture capital funded. And so the distinction there is in one person has all their eggs, in the basket, or I guess maybe what's the better way to put it? There's one person who's got all their skin in the game and they own the entirety of the company. In a venture-backed company, there are investors, there's a board, there are people who eventually want their money to come back. And so they're sort of pushing and pulling the company in different directions. And this company had a product to sell. They were making a big pivot. They had formerly sort of been in this very niche, like, you've got to know exactly what you want in the cybersecurity world to come to us. And they were going to say, okay, we want to build this product that all these commercial companies are going to want, and it's going to be interesting to them. And so I joined as a standard software engineer there again. And this was like a really exciting thing because their compensation model was different. You got equity in the company. So you got pre-IPO shares in this company. And so if the company does well, you do well. Of course, everyone's like, well, like, my shares cost 10 cents a piece, but oh my gosh, if the stock price was $100, I'll be a gazillionaire. And there's all sorts of human psychology associated with that. But the end state was, it's a really exciting place to work. You're very optimistic. You're writing a lot of code every day. You're working long hours. And I found that pretty enjoyable. And I'd say it was sort of just a continuation, right? Like, I was learning more software languages. I was learning how they're applied. And I was working with these other engineers who had just a ton of experience, and they knew all these interesting tools and shortcuts and ways of doing things. And so it was just like a really cool time when I was learning, for 40 hours a week, basically, from these people who had, and they might be a couple of years younger than me, but they had just thousands of hours more time writing code than I did. And there was really no good reason to leave that company, except that my wife, one day she came home, she's at the State Department, and she said, "Hey, do you want to move to France?" And we had sort of always batted around the idea like, well, you're a diplomat. If we moved overseas, like that would be nice, but you always imagine you'll go to like a random country in the world, like it would be a surprise, like, oh, we're going to move to Vietnam, or something like that. But she was like, Paris. I was like, Paris? Yeah, I'd quit my job for that. And so I quit my job. Yeah. I was like, no, I don't think I'm, like this company is good, but I could probably get another job in Paris. And at that point, she was expecting twins. And so there was a lot of change going on in our life. And so the twins came 6 months later. We got on a plane, flew to Paris, and I had interviewed actually. So I sort of course, I was like, well, either I'm going to be a nanny to twin infants or I'm going to get a job in Paris. And I was like, I bought a French dictionary and I installed Duolingo on my phone and I got to work. And so I interviewed with a bunch of companies over in France. And one of them was like an ad tech company, by which I mean they present banner ads on the internet. You click the banner ad, they charge their customer, they make money. So I had flown over there and done the interviews with them. They extended an offer, and that was that.
Because I'm guessing all the programming language is the same, just not the language that everybody's speaking on a day-to-day basis.
You're right. Actually, like because computer science, I don't know, like maybe computer science was like born in a different country, but America's the leader in computer industry stuff, right? Like a lot of computer programming languages come out of America, or they're invented in America, or they're invented by foreigners in America, but the documentation is almost always in English. And so if you speak English, you've got a really interesting advantage because the words that you use to describe these concepts are not your typical entry level words. And so I found the company I found runs a large R&D department in Paris. They're a huge company, probably like eight or 9,000 people. They brought people from all over the world to live and work in Paris. And so they were like, it's fine if you speak English. There are a bunch of teams where speaking English is totally fine. There are definitely other teams where you should probably learn French really well. And I ended up working with some of those teams, but it was, I'd say like the expat life is pretty nice. They sent me to not to English classes. They sent me to French classes, and, everyone's struggling to learn French together. So if you work hard at it, you'll get it done.
And raise twins. That's a lot of work. Working State Department, my goodness. So then you got back to the States. So what happened after that?
So a diplomat only spends a couple of years overseas, and then they'll go to another assignment. So we knew that there was going to be an end to this adventure in France. And actually, it was through the Marine Corps that I was, of course, like when you move to France and you have a guest room, everybody is your friend. Like everybody is, is like, hey, I'm going to be in Paris next week. Do you know of a good, cheap place to stay? And the answer is always yes. I have a guest room. You can stay with me. And so, actually, a friend from the Marine Corps, very tangential friend. He stayed over. We had dinner, and he was kind of like, "What are you going to do? When you get back to the States?" I was like, "I don't know. I guess I'll have to get another job." But we're sort of open about where we move when we go back to the States. And he said, "Well, I'm at Amazon. Have you ever thought of working at Amazon?" And I was like, not really, if I'm honest. Like Amazon's a warehouse company. I'm not that interested in that. He was like, no, there's AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, which is like, I don't know, like a multi-billion-dollar arm of Amazon. And Amazon has like Prime and Alexa and like all these other things. So you should look at it. He was like, I'm just going to put you in the referral database and they'll reach out to you about a job. And then I also reached out to a bunch of other companies. I interviewed at Google. I interviewed at a couple other kind of random places, but Amazon got back to me pretty quick, and we did a phone screen, and they said that was pretty good. Do you want to do another phone screen? So I did another phone screen. I said, sure, fine. Then, like a day later, they said, that was nice. Give us your passport number. We'll fly you over here, and you'll do a a full, 5-person interview loop. So I did that. And then like 3 days later, they were like, hey, here's an offer. And I was pretty impressed by that. Of the big tech companies, Amazon is the one that people call the most aggressive or the most similar to the military. And I think it's true, right? Like I accepted the offer. They were super business-like, super aggressive with everything. At every turn, they're like, hey, like the goal is to get you into a chair in Seattle, Washington. What does it take to do that? Like here's relocation, here's money for this, here's a person who's going to walk you through all these processes. And that sort of militaristic or aggressive efficiency continues into working there. And I felt comfortable with that. Like I really appreciated that culture that was very straightforward and very focused on results. And so I did about 3 years at Amazon. The trade-off at Amazon is sometimes the work-life balance can be a little tough. And so eventually, a recruiter from Google came knocking and I said, look, I don't think you can actually make your resume worse by going from Amazon to Google. So I think I'll give it a try. And actually, it's pretty nice. So I've been at Google for a couple of years now.
That was a great overview, just taking us through kind of the different places that you work, including Amazon. I think a lot of the things that you're saying about Amazon very much comport with some of the other conversations I've had with people. It's a very aggressive company. They hold a high standard. They're very strategic in their hiring too. And then a lot of the people that leave, it's because of a work-life balance. But those that stay in and thrive on that, they end up doing really well. So I'd just like to ask you a few questions, kind of get into coaching the transitioner, right? If you could just tell us a little bit about maybe what it means to work for a large IT or tech company from your perspective.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, actually, especially in interviews when I interview people for jobs. I think working at a big company is significantly different from working for a small company. And I think it manifests itself in how your day-to-day job goes, which is that in a big company, it is much more specific, has been my experience, right? So in other companies, I've found people will come and say, hey, could you help us write the contract? Or could you help us write the the documents that we're going to use to try to win this contract? Or could you go to this conference and stand at a booth and kind of talk about what it's like to be, like writing software, or what we provide? At bigger companies, there are people where that's their full-time job, right? Like they go out and they win contracts, and that's like their 40-hour-a-week job, or they market the company. And so as a software engineer at a bigger company, you spend all of your time writing software. Similarly, as a program manager at a big company, I spend all of my time doing program management. There's almost nothing to distract me from that work, and that's nice in some ways. But there's also like sort of some people think of it as a downside, but it's what I call the big company tax, which is maybe you joined a company to do really exciting work, building some new software thing. You might spend 80% of your time building that new software thing, right? Like as a program manager, you're talking to people, setting milestones, gathering information about how long things will take, talking about technical designs. And that's all very exciting. But 20% of your time, you're going to spend on what I call the big company tax, which is that, like it's just, there's so many teams at bigger companies that you have to govern all of them. And so maybe some senior team or some executive somewhere will say, we've decided we're not going to use this one programming language at this version anymore. You have to use a newer version. And guess what? You're going to spend 20% of your time going to every single team that you work with and saying, you all need to upgrade this from this to that. Is it worth it? I don't really mind that kind of work. I think it's nice to have something to do like after lunch, but your mileage may vary. Like other people might find that sort of culture of like, I can't say no to this very difficult or semi-insane or just straight up boring request. Some people find that pretty tough.
That's interesting. I'm going to remember that too, because that one of my takeaways is, and I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this. The larger the company, the more the specialized positions are. And then if you're in a smaller company, the more maybe broad array of tasks you might be performing. Is that accurate?
I think that's true. But I'll admittedly say my experience has ranged from 200-person companies to 100,000 person companies. And so I've lived on the extremes, but I haven't spent much time at like the 50,000 person company. Um, but I think you're right. Like at a big company, there's just so much more structure. And I'll also say promotions wise, like you have to really tend and care for your career in a civilian company much more than in the military. The military pushes you upwards, right? Like they're not forcing you into promotions, but there's a clear, well lit path. You are this rank. The next rank you want to be is this. At a big company, I find that it's really nice that there's oftentimes a rubric and a job description. And, like at big companies, you'll get leveled, which means you're like a level 2 or a level 3 or a level 4. And then you're in like a certain job family, like I'm a technical program manager. Um, and the path from one level to the next is very clear. And it's also decided by committee, and there are checks and balances. At smaller companies, one of my biggest frustrations was I didn't drink enough beer with my bosses. And I felt like that really was the way to get promoted, was to build that sort of rapport with your boss. And then if there's only 4 devs, on the team, that you're going to be next for promotion. It was way less transparent to me at a small company why some people were getting promoted and I wasn't, as opposed to now, like at a larger company, I feel like I know exactly why am or am not going to get promoted.
Let me ask you another question. I think there's other than, I don't know, I think it's probably outdated now, but learn to code meme, you know, and some of it may, in retrospect, I don't know, maybe speak to transitioning careers or transitioning jobs, and there are coding boot camps out there. And so people that actually like the idea of maybe writing software, becoming a software engineer, but don't necessarily have a bachelor's degree in computer science. What does it mean to learn to code and try and like is it even realistic to go to a coding boot camp and then get hired on as a software engineer?
I think the first question when you ask, I want to go from zero to coding, my first question is always about what is your motivation? A lot of people I see, they go on the internet, they go to levels.fyi, they see what a senior software engineer makes, and they say, I would also like to make that paycheck, right? Which is totally rational, right? Like more money, better. We all get this. The real problem is those skill sets are pretty rare, and the work is very specific, and the work is for a lot of people like mind-numbingly boring. Like it's lonely because you're just with this computer, and you're talking about problems that are very abstract, and it if you don't like it, it's probably pretty painful. And so the first question I always ask people who say like, oh my gosh, you work in big tech, like how do I get a job in big tech too, writing software, is are you sure you want to write software? Like, do you like puzzles? Do you like brain teasers? Do you have like this insatiable desire to understand how things work and to take things apart and put things back together? Because if you don't, and you do spend all of your time staring at a black screen with white text on it, trying to figure out what this latest error that the computer has given you means, you are going to be in for like a pretty unpleasant, 8 to 12 hour day every day of the week. So that's the first thing I always want to check with people and be like, look, are you sure you want to do that? And also there are other jobs, but can a coding bootcamp take you from zero to a software engineering position? I think it's entirely possible. I don't think I've ever met somebody who's done it, but I don't really ask people about their backgrounds that often. Like I don't want to question people, but the most traditional route is to get a bachelor's in computer science, which I think a lot of people can't do. I certainly couldn't do it today if I decided to go and get another bachelor's degree or something. I would not be able to tell my wife like, hey, we're going to pause our lives. So I would say anecdotally, I don't think the boot camp is the way to go. But I will say how I would do it is I would probably find some way to get my foot in the door at a big tech company or at like a medium or small tech company. And I think I'd start to work my way up. There are plenty of training programs. I think Amazon even has like a data center technician training program. So like there are these guys who go into the data centers and they like swap out hard drives or motherboards, or they install new racks. Well, those people are obviously interested in computers. There are ways that they can start to write like a little bit of code, and then there's like training programs where Amazon will take them and say like, okay, like, you've sort of done everything you can do in a data center. You've exhibited this problem solving desire. Why don't we make you into some sort of like, an operations engineer or something like that, like somebody who does not super complex software, but hey, like start writing some code, see how it goes. And then there are ways to sort of work your way up. But I think it's almost like a get rich quick scheme to think you can go from like zero coding ability to like a full-time coding job. And I think it's tough too. A lot of it is not just writing code, but learning about the tools that you write code in and the tools that manage code and test code and deploy code. And so there's just a whole ecosystem out there you have to learn.
No, that's great. I think you also mentioned not to make it too doom and gloom too. I'm wondering but I mean, this is good information as well, because I think there's this, I mean, I'll even admit I've flirted with the idea, actually run the simulation in my mind. What would it be like to become a software engineer, to write code, to write programs, create programs? I downloaded a couple apps. I watched a couple of YouTube videos and realized it's not necessarily my forte. But what I do like is I do like some of the culture in the IT world. Like just from a PM standpoint, I've tried to adopt as many like agile practices and philosophies as I can in project management, trying to deviate from using a hybrid approach where most of the stuff we do is waterfall. But I mean, I've used Kanban. I've done sprints for iterative development of poorly designed, poorly structured problems. But I think you had mentioned once before, we had talked that these companies are huge and they need expertise in things other than just software engineering. I mean, could you speak to that for a sec?
Yeah. Okay. So this is like the upbeat part, I think, which is I was like sort of doom and gloom on the software engineer part. So sorry for that. But we were just talking before the podcast about this, which is, when you join the Marine Corps, people are like, oh, so you're going to be a rifleman. But there are tons of other jobs. And I think you have to find the job that fits your passions and it fits the niche that you have built for yourself or the skills that you know. And the fact is, like, look at Amazon. Amazon's got like 1 million employees, right? There are not just software engineers. There are people who are designing physical devices. There are people who are doing logistics, right? Like the Amazon logistics network is insane and huge. There are people buying real estate for Amazon. There are people selling AWS products. There are people selling, like I don't know, whatever physical things that Amazon makes, those like Alexa things and stuff like that. Obviously, I didn't like bone up on my knowledge of Amazon before this. I was in like a very specific part of Amazon, but the important thing is, I think, to find those jobs that are very similar or use similar skill sets as what you might have used in the military, the Marine Corps, and start to target those jobs yourself. And so I think you're talking about I'm managing projects myself, and I'm trying to use these methodologies, and I'm trying to do this and that. I think that's a great start. Like that is what I usually tell people is start looking at all the work you're doing through the lens of a different job description. Because I didn't realize, for quite some time, I went to France and I was doing all this like hardcore coding. And then they were like, hey, do you want to be a program manager instead of a coder? You seem really good at this coordinating between people thing. And then I looked back and I looked at all of the things that I had done in the military and down in Fayetteville. And I thought, oh, I am taking groups of people and tying them together and making sure that they're aligned. And then I'm tracking their progress and I'm nagging the slow ones and, kind of holding the fast ones back. Maybe I should be a project manager, not a software engineer. And that worked out pretty well for me.
Hey, Sis, do you have any questions?
What really hit me earlier when you were talking about promotions and moving forward in the process, and when you're in a smaller company, not knowing if it's just, are you culturally belonging the way you should be in order to advance? It's not really a question. It's more of, it's definitely prevalent in a lot of companies. And I know my company, it's much smaller. It's, under 200 people. And for many years, they didn't have a structure of what that looks like. It's kind of, who's the right hand man of this person, and they'll probably get promoted. And if you're not, then, I hate saying a popularity contest, but it kind of was like that. But now I think a lot more companies, because you have to have pay transparency and you have to make sure that you are able to recruit the right people by showing what our values are, and what type of benefits you offer to the employees. It's becoming more and more necessary to make sure that that plan is put in place for no matter how big the company is. So, but it's taking a long time for a lot of other companies to actually get up to that point. So I just wanted to say that that is still a problem and it's still being faced today. But
I was pretty surprised when I left the military because I would go, I would join some organization, and all of a sudden you discover that everything's not as simple as it was in the military, right? Like in the military, I was a sergeant. And if you were a corporal, then I told you what to do. And if you're a staff sergeant, you told me what to do. And then all of a sudden, I had a boss, of course, but then my boss, he didn't really have a rank, right? And then the person from marketing who would tell my boss, no, you're definitely going to add that feature to the software. Why did my boss say yes to that person? That person doesn't have any direct reports. That person doesn't have like a rank associated with them. So for me, I think there was a long learning curve of figuring out where do people fit in to this power hierarchy, and how should I behave within it? Like that, I think was very
mm,
confusing for a person who had never worked anywhere but the Marine Corps or other places where there were like really strict power hierarchies. I think that sitting back and figuring out what's going on here, like that can be really valuable.
Jimmy, to kind of wrap this thing up, I'd like to ask you a question I ask all guests. If there are two or three things you'd like transitioning service members to remember, what are they?
Okay, so I think one is that you're going to be the new fish wherever you go. And you should be willing to sort of sit back and learn and understand that everybody around you has been doing this for quite some time and that you're new, and just be willing to sort of suspend all your disbelief or all your doubts and say, this is really weird. This is definitely not how we would do it in the Marine Corps, but I'm just going to chill out for a second and be totally silent and just ask, or maybe even better than totally silent, I'm going to ask a ton of questions and sort of like train myself on this new foreign world before you start to make moves. Like that is one thing that I think, just like be really willing to learn. That's one thing. Another thing is, I think your risk meter when you leave the Marine Corps or the military, your risk meter might be like a little miscalibrated, because there's almost no way to lose your job in the military, but there are many ways to lose your job in the civilian world. And so, whenever I talk to transitioning service people, then I'll say, okay, but what's the worst thing that could happen, right? Like if you lose your job, what are the bad things that will happen then? Or like, they'll say, I don't want to apply for this job in whatever state they, may or may not be sure their spouse is willing to move to. And I'll say, okay, but if you do the interview, actually the worst thing that can happen is they say no. You can't really have a discussion about moving to Seattle or DC or Portland or whatever until you're holding an offer letter in your hand. So do the risky thing, because actually, like, you don't have a decision to make today. There's one other thing I would say: use your network. I have always depended on my network, even sometimes unconsciously. I've not realized I was, like dialing into my network. Like when that Marine came to Paris and said, look, I'll put you in the system at Amazon, that was life changing for me. That's how I got my next job. And so I'd say, stay in touch with people, ask people if you can talk to their friends, and even cold call a few people and just say like, hey, I want to have a conversation about this. I don't know, what it would be like to do this job, but you've got that job and you're on LinkedIn. Could you tell me more? And you know what? Most people are kind of like 30 minutes with a stranger. Sure, I'll do that. The worst thing that will happen is it'll be weird.
And it is sometimes.
Yes, it can be.
All right. Good to know. Good to know. Well, Jimmy, hey, thank you so much. New fish, like that's a first in over 31 episodes. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you providing insight in just the world in which you work in, and sharing some personal stories. I know our listeners, including myself, are going to benefit from. So thank you very much, Jimmy. Thanks for coming on.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. We'll be in touch. All right. Well, Jimmy has left the virtual studio. All right, sis, what do you got?
There was one thing that he actually mentioned towards the beginning when he was talking about getting his first job. And it was how he mentioned something about he just got lucky, that he probably should have done a little bit more research in the beginning, but he actually landed something pretty good, pretty sustainable in the beginning. And it just makes me think of, so many people are so eager to get a new job or to start something new or to start their new life. And that if they find something that checks all the boxes, then they just kind of run with it. And I think that that's, it's not a bad choice or a bad decision. But there's always this really great saying that I've been using a lot more lately, where it just because it zips doesn't mean it fits, So sometimes it might look really good and you think it's going to work out really well because it's checking all those boxes. But, you just got to be careful if you haven't done any research in the beginning. But, sometimes taking the big leap isn't a bad thing either. And he's a testament to that.
Yeah. And just like Samantha Gassman that we interviewed, you don't have to nail it as soon as you get out, right? Because you kind of don't know what you don't know. Granted, he said he could probably do more research. I'm putting myself in his shoes. I'm in my mid to late 20s. I got out as a sergeant. I'm single. Bro, we've got a great job for you in Fayetteville, and you can be part of the family. I would be doing the same thing probably. I mean, I can't blame him. I just think it's interesting to once again listen to the evolution of where his career path took him. It wasn't a straight line, and it actually had some adventure along the way. So that's great. Just for the audience, I know that Jimmy sent us a message, and one of the things that he wished he would have said was that your soft skills and judgment, the judgment, decision-making ability that you developed in the military, that's something also worthwhile doubling down on. He put it in the context of, one of the, and this is, there's a connection between this, but he had been asked before, why do software engineers or those that do a lot of coding and write software, why do they get paid so much? And he's like, because if you think about it, one wrong line of code and you can't close a tab in a Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome. And guess what? That one error is going to affect everybody that uses that software. And so there's a lot of care that has to go into selecting the right people and making sure that you have high quality engineering and high quality engineers to do it. But he also said that just in the sphere in which he works, judgment, there are a lot of judgment calls that have to be made. Like, do we release this software update? Has it received enough testing, and then having the judgment to say, okay, well, let's look at this from a risk perspective, whether that's, I don't know, kind of the same way we do our ORM, but you can just apply it to a different scenario. Those types of judgment abilities and decision-making abilities that we developed in the military, he said, will benefit us as we move on to our next careers, particularly if they're in the world of IT and tech. So Jimmy gave us some great information, and thank you. Thank you for listening. If you're listening to me talk, you stayed on the net. You've listened, stayed on the net. I'm so dated.
Oh, yikes.
I know. But anyway, hey, we appreciate it. You can follow our content on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, even YouTube. like or subscribe. We'd appreciate it. It beats the metrics so that transitioning service members can easily find this information as they're, putting in a search or checking out a hashtag. You can send us some feedback. You can reach us at newmissionct@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your feedback, or you could hit us up, Sis and I, on LinkedIn. We have a presence there, and we're always willing to listen to your messages. And I don't know, maybe you've got a recommendation for our next guest. If you're a service member and you're preparing for your own transition, know that I'm right there with you. So until next time, stay focused.